Okay, yesterday we started a new general subject. I want to start again and go back through some of what I did yesterday and do it with some more examples and make sure that we're all on the same page. We talk about the things we know, things we don't know, things we have opinions about, we're not sure. The question is, what does it mean to know? When is a person entitled to say he knows that something is true? Clearly, to know something is true, you have to have a good reason for thinking it so. It can't be arbitrary. We gave the example of the guy who says, I know it's going to rain tomorrow. How do you know? Because I flipped a coin, heads it's sunny and tails it's rain. It came up tails. So that's how I know it's going to rain tomorrow. We say to him, you don't know. And we will not listen if he says, it's my life and I identify as a knower. And the reason that you believe it's going to rain is because the coin came up tails. You don't know. That's not called knowing, because knowing requires that you have a good reason for thinking it so. Then the question will be, well, how much reason is a good reason? How much evidence, how much probability must you have to say you have enough to know? And one simple, intuitive answer to that question is, your reason has to be good enough to rule out every other alternative, every other possibility. So if he says he knows, all I have to do to defeat him is exercise my imagination and think up, no matter how weird, how unlikely, how unreasonable the alternative is. If it's an alternative he hasn't covered, then he can't say that he knows. In other words, to know would mean to know for sure, infallibly, with certainty, that it's so. And when we discuss knowledge, when people claim knowledge and we question it, some of our vocabulary, some of the way we talk, does sound like that. A person says, I know it's Q. And we say, how do you know it's not R? What are we asking? You say it's Q. How do you eliminate the other possibility of R? I'm asking the question because if you can't eliminate R, then you don't really know it's Q. How do you know it's not? Couldn't it still be? Couldn't it still be? Couldn't it means, isn't it possible that? If I say, couldn't it still be, what I'm inviting him to do is to eliminate all other possibilities. Well, is that reasonable or isn't it reasonable? Descartes thought it was. That's how he set up his philosophy. He was one of the people who started modern philosophy. But almost all, I would say, philosophers have come to the conclusion that it's unreasonable. Something weaker has to be substituted. There's a lot of literature on what the weaker thing is and how to describe it and how to define it, but there's very, very widespread agreement that demanding absolute infallibility, absolute certainty, wiping out all other possibilities is not a correct criterion. Why? Why isn't it a correct criterion? The first observation that these sources make is that, according to that criterion, there isn't any knowledge at all. So let's think about that. Is that really right? There's nothing at all that you could know because, with certainty, with it being impossible that you're making a mistake. So let's see, think about the kinds of mistakes that you make. A mistake about where your keys are, or what the weather will be, or whether that was a good investment. Are you likely to have made a mistake about who your parents are? Not really. I've never heard of anybody who made a mistake about something like that. But now, according to Descartes, do you recognize it's possible that you're wrong? Well, isn't it possible you're adopted and they didn't tell you? Possible. Could you rule that out as a possibility? So as we said yesterday, but I look like my parents. And I explained to you yesterday why that is, because they took their baby pictures with them to the orphanage, and they looked for a baby who looked like their baby pictures. Man, that's far out, Rabbi. Yeah, it's far out, but isn't it possible? Can you show me it's impossible that they did that? I had a DNA test. So as I said yesterday, first of all, you didn't. And second of all, even if you did, isn't it possible that they paid off the lab to lie to you about the results? I mean, you're checking your parents 24/7, 365. You're watching all their emails, all the telephone calls. Certainly it's possible they did that. So it comes out, you don't know who your parents are. That's strange. I thought I did. But here's this criterion. It's got to be infallible. Knock out all other possibilities. Well, let's keep trying. How about 2 + 2 is 4? That's really hard to imagine how that could be false. But does the fact that I can't imagine how it could be false mean that it can't be false? The fact that I can't imagine it? Is that a guarantee? Haven't there been things in the past which people couldn't imagine, which turned out to be true? Like the earth isn't flat. Or the earth is in motion. Earth's in motion. What's the matter with you? You're sitting on it. You know it's not in motion. You don't feel the wind whipping through your hair, do you? You don't feel the breeze. Of course it's not in motion. You could see it's not in motion. But it turns out it is in motion. So the fact that you can't imagine how that could work mean that it's guaranteed that you didn't fail? If there are other things which you couldn't imagine turned out to be wrong, maybe this is another one of them. You can't imagine it, and someday you'll learn how it could be, how it could fail, even though you couldn't imagine it. What about logic? Just straight logic. I have a box. The box is divided into 2 parts, A and B. Everything in the box is either in A or in B. I have something which is not in A, and it's not in B, but it's in the box. Could that be right? Something that's not in A and not in B, but is in the box. Well, according to quantum mechanics, that could be true. Because when you talk about the location of something, location is inherently fuzzy. Not that you can't measure it precisely enough. If you have better instrumentation, you'll be able to measure it, you'll be able to know it better. No, a thing doesn't have a precise location. Now make the box very, very small. So small that being in A, the A half, would mean that the particle has too close to a precise location, and quantum mechanics says it can't have a location like that. And being the B half is also the same thing. But being in the whole box, not differentiating between A and B, that's okay, according to quantum mechanics. That gives it enough freedom so that we don't have something that's too tightly defined. So there was a fellow named Finkelstein, professor of physics, who said, on the basis of quantum mechanics, maybe we should revise logic. Up until now, we would have said to be in the box is to be either in A or in B, because that exhausts the whole box. And quantum mechanics taught us that that piece of logic isn't correct. Doesn't describe the real world in the correct way. So if you could imagine revising that piece of logic, What other piece of logic can you say, I know for sure, couldn't be revised? Because I can't imagine how. So what if you can't imagine how? Your imagination doesn't win the day. And let me finish, then I'll take questions. Let me finish with the one I mentioned yesterday at the end. I know that I exist. That's a really tough one. You know, how could you imagine that you don't exist? Who's doing the imagining, right? But Descartes, who said this in his own, was criticized for this in his own lifetime. There is a way to imagine that you don't exist. And in fact, David Hume wrote a book called The Treatise of Human Nature, and he has a postscript in which he says, I have spent, 300 pages describing human nature, and I noticed that I have left out the self. I wonder if I made a mistake. I wonder if there's something I just forgot to put in, or maybe there isn't a self. And you think, come on, are you crazy? What are you talking about? Well, here's how it would work, and there may be other ways as well, but here's how it would work. Someone says, I exist, or I'm thinking. And the critic says, you're speaking English, and sometimes the way English works creates a false impression, and you may be taken in by the false impression to think things have been settled when they haven't. I'll give you an example, says the critic. Take the English sentence, 2 words, it's raining. Okay? What's the it that's doing the raining? What's the it that's doing the raining? I don't know, the centaurs, the leprechauns, the dinosaurs? What's the it that's doing the raining? The natural answer is, don't be silly, come on, wake up. It's raining doesn't mean there's an it doing the raining. It just means rain is falling. That's all it means. It's just a way in English that you say, rain is falling. The average taxpayer pays $5,000 of tax a year. The average taxpayer. Tell me, where does he live? How old is he? Does he own a dog? When's the last time he tried to take a trip to Alaska? No. The average taxpayer in the name of a person like John Smith. It means take all the taxpayers and you add up all the taxes and you divide by the number of taxpayers, and this is what you get. It isn't if there's a person who's the average taxpayer. That's just the way we talk. We talk that way, but you have to understand what the talk means. Okay, so the critic says, I exist. I'm thinking. Maybe that's just a fancy way of saying there's thinking going on. But not there's a thing I doing the thinking. That's an activity with an agent performing the activity. Who says that that's the way you have to understand it? Maybe it's just a description of things that are happening without an agent making them happen. So even if I exist as a sentence is convincing, as something you wouldn't want to deny, the question is not, how could it go wrong? The question is, what does it mean when you say, I exist? If it means nothing more than it's raining, you don't get your existence out of it. So, if even I exist could go down the drain, man, how are you going to guarantee that anything couldn't go down the drain? And if you can't guarantee that anything couldn't go down the drain, then you don't know anything. So, the literature says that's a good reason not to accept the criterion that knowledge requires absolute certainty, absolute infallibility, because that criterion gives you the result that you don't know anything. Are you with me so far? Now, the philosophically trained critic will say, wait a minute, maybe that's the right outcome. Sometimes you discover things that you didn't expect beforehand. And maybe the right outcome, there's a guy named Peter Unger who thinks there is no knowledge. The rest of us think he's nuts, but that's what he thinks. So, who says that you can't discover surprising things, like there is no knowledge. And the answer to that question is, you can discover surprising things, but if you're going to discover something surprising, you better have a good basis to draw your conclusion on. Your basis should be stronger than you're surprised about the conclusion. Because if it isn't, the surprising conclusion is a good reason to reject your basis. So here's how the game has been played so far. The critic starts with an assumption. It's a free world. You can make any assumptions you want. It's just that I don't have to buy your conclusions. He starts with an assumption that knowledge requires absolute certainty and infallibility. And then he draws a conclusion, there is no knowledge. And I say, well, I have two choices here. Either I can knuckle under and accept this very distasteful, surprising, shocking conclusion that there's no knowledge, or I can reject your assumption. Pray tell me, what is your basis for your assumption? What foundation does it have? What claim to fame? What does it do that I need to have done? Why should I be interested in that assumption? Why shouldn't I, seeing the reasoning go to the conclusion that if the knowledge requires certainty, then there's no knowledge, turn it around and say, that's a good reason to reject your assumption. And here, Peter Unger and company don't have much to say. They started with an assumption that infallibility is needed, and they just kept pushing it down the road. But it isn't as if there was a revelation at Sinai, knowledge requires requires infallibility and absolute certainty, and I'm following God's word. That's certainly not it. So many people said, since we use the word knowledge, we describe things as some as knowledge, some not. We discuss and debate this. We change our minds. I thought I knew, but I see now that I didn't know. That sounds like we're talking about something we understand. You're trying to tell me we're making a terrible mistake. The whole thing has no application whatsoever. No, I want to see the credit that your assumption has. And no one has been able to provide that kind of credit. Even though, as I said, intuitively we say, how do you know it's not? Couldn't it also be? But that's in everyday talk. Question is how seriously we take that talk. And when you start to push the envelope to, E.T. or leprechauns and so on and so on, at that point most people say, you're not being serious. I have to rule out leprechauns to make my point? That's just not serious. No, that's going too far. So this is the reason that the vast majority have said, no, you don't need absolute infallibility. And it is a bit of a scandal that we don't have anything precise and agreed upon to replace it with, but that doesn't mean that the conclusion is wrong. It's just that it's a hard problem. Describing knowledge is a hard problem. Indeed, there's one famous philosopher who wrote a 3-page paper in a third-rate journal 40 years ago, maybe more than 40 years ago, Edmund Gettier. And he posed a problem for knowledge, and for 40 years, no one's been able to solve it, and he hasn't published anything else. He just created a new industry, the Gettier problem. And when people write about knowledge, they say, and someday we'll solve that problem. In the meantime, we'll do other things, because we don't know how to solve it. So knowledge is a hard concept. It's a hard subject. And we haven't been able to solve it yet. But that doesn't mean people are going to go back to the criterion that you need infallibility and the conclusion there isn't any knowledge. That's going too far. Okay? Okay, that's the general background. Now, deciding how much reason is good reason, how much evidence you have to have, how much probability you have to have, it depends a lot on what you're going to do with the decision. When you decide that it's so, what are you going to do with that decision? Especially if the decision about what's true is going to trigger an action of some kind, then the standards will vary with the outcome of the action and with the types of evidence that are that are required. So, in the example that I gave with the person with the symptoms of two diseases, it could be that 52% versus 48% is enough to decide what to do. Now, if you ask a person, do you know that the 52% choice is the right choice? So he'll say, I don't know, but it's the better bet for getting the person, for saving the person's life. So I'm telling you to act on that one because it's the better bet. And that's certainly an appropriate thing to do. Some people want to say that's all there is. All there is choosing what's the better bet. Choosing what's the reasonable thing to do as if it were true without deciding that it is true or isn't true. Even if it's 90%, you could say, I'm not telling you that it's true. I'm not deciding that it's true. All I'm doing is saying that when the probability of this is 90%, the other is 10%, then it's a good thing to bet on it 3-1. Because you got a 9-1 chance of winning. So if you bet on things like that 3-1, over time you'll make a profit. That would remove the question altogether. It would be as if to say, maybe there is a concept of knowledge, and maybe it has criteria, and maybe you could discuss and debate when it applies, but it doesn't play any practical role. We don't need it for anything. We just calculate the probabilities. That's a how shall I say? It's an attitude towards calculating probabilities and deciding what to do, but it isn't an attitude that tells you how much you should invest in what you're doing. Let me just give one piece of background because I'm going to say something and people have rightly objected that what I'm saying isn't quite true if you're on the inside and I'm playing to the outside. I'm playing to an outsider who hasn't made his decision yet that the Torah is true. And if you're an insider, then the words don't play right. I'm talking about probability with respect to religion. When I say reason to believe, I mean for an outsider, it's reasonable for him to believe because I'm going to give him enough evidence and probability to believe. But as an insider, we say, some people say every day, the 13 principles of faith. So they call it emunah. I believe with a perfect faith that. And although the words in Hebrew can be interpreted as not being about faith and belief, but rather faithfulness to principles, and I have that in my book, still, there are those, like the Ramchal and the Das Tunis, who do express absolute confidence in these principles of belief. So someone said, several people objected to me, if your decision is made on the basis of probability, let's say it's 80% or 90%, still 90% doesn't give you perfect confidence. It gives you a 90% probability. And you'll be willing to take a bet at 5-1 and at 8-1, well, it's going to win, but not at 20-1, because you only have a 90% probability that it's true. And this statement in the Siddur says, I have complete confidence. So I thought that was a good objection. I put it up on my blog where I have a whole outline of this material. And I said, I'm talking about someone from the outside. Someone from the outside has the survival of the Jewish people, the uniqueness of revelation at Sinai, it has predictions in the Torah. All of this gives that person probability that it's true. The person on the inside has something else. He has something else in addition to all of that. And I think that something else, in addition to all of that, can give him the confidence, complete confidence. And I want to explain what the difference is between complete confidence on the one hand and infallibility that we were talking about before, which we said was the wrong criterion. Let's take, for example, the proposition that you are right now sitting in a room with tables in it. Could that be wrong? Well, as Descartes said, maybe you're dreaming. Or maybe someone slipped your lunch food with delayed response LSD, and you're now hallucinating. I mean, isn't that possible? Yeah, it is possible. But I think that you can't take it seriously. That's not a table? Really? Can you entertain a doubt? Can you feel uncertain about it? Sort of, in danger? Should I put my cup down? Maybe it'll go through and fall on the floor because maybe it's not a table. There's a difference between calculating abstractly, are there possibilities that it could go wrong, versus making decisions on that basis and having it affect your attitudes towards what you're doing. You don't doubt in any way whatsoever that you're sitting at a table, because experientially you're overwhelmed with the evidence that you have. Maybe certainty, after all, the word certainty is a psychological word. It's one of the problems with Descartes. It's a psychological word. I'm certain that. Maybe certainty can mean not there are no possible alternatives, but certainty can mean it's an idea that I can't do anything with. It's an idea that I can't use in any way. And maybe that's enough. I have no doubts because I have no way to entertain the doubt. I have nothing to do with the doubt. And maybe that's a criterion for knowledge which will cover a lot of ground. In the medieval times, there were 3 areas of knowledge. One was experience, things you directly experience, which is a vast array of your information. There's things that you have experienced, and things which logic dictate. 2 plus 2 is 4. Even if there are other things which I couldn't imagine how they could be wrong, and they turned out to be wrong. So the fact that I have my inability to imagine that it's wrong doesn't mean that it has to be right. It's still true that I can't imagine how it could be wrong. And since I can't imagine how it could be wrong, there's nothing I can do with the doubt. Maybe 2 plus 2 is really 5, maybe. Yeah? Okay. So what? Or maybe it's really 3, and if you want to make sure you can have enough apples for supper, eat one before you get home. Because otherwise, when you go home, maybe the 2 plus 2 will be 3, and then you won't be losing any apples, will you? Because the 2 plus 2 really will be 3. So you'll have all of them. Right? I mean, I can't, there's nothing I can do with it. I can't integrate it into my life in any way. And that's enough to credit it as knowledge, because knowledge doesn't require infallibility. Then you'll have, by the way, the third area which presents knowledge of that type is the Torah, because it comes from prophecy, and prophecy is experience of the highest order, so that it has that background to it. So here you would have a way of defending the idea of something being knowledge, not just probability, but real knowledge, without its being infallible. You can even acknowledge that it's fallible, but you can claim that it's knowledge and not just probability, and not just probability, because Probability, there's an element of probability, and then you could prepare for it or take cautions about it, have two strategies, one for the 90%, one for the 10%, but here there's nothing to do. There's no way to deal with it in any practical sense.
Okay. The question, how do we validate prophecy as argument? Because what's the difference between, for example, Christian prophets, Muslim prophets, Buddhist prophets, and Jewish prophets?
Okay, this is a very important question, and I'll do, let's say, a medium-sized job on it. I've done the long job a number of times, and it is on various websites where my lectures are. But this is a serious problem, and the Rambam attacks this problem, and really the verse in the Torah attacks this problem directly. Let's say that a person does miracles. Should that convince you that he's a prophet, that God spoke to him? So, there's a verse in the Torah, Exodus 19, in the run-up to the revelation of Sinai, where God says to Moses, I'm going to come to you in the thick cloud so that the people will hear me speaking to you and will believe in you forever. So the Rambam analyzes. Apparently, if God didn't do that, there'd be no guarantee that people would believe in him forever. It's only because our ancestors heard God speak to him. In other words, they themselves had the same prophecy that he had. That's why they were convinced. It was a direct experience of theirs. Now, the Rambam asks, well, if that's why Moses got his credibility, what about all later prophets? None of the later prophets were overheard by the people hearing God speak to them. And the answer is because Moses gave us criteria for identifying people as prophets, and says the Rambam, strictly speaking, we don't know that they're prophets. The Rambam is very strict about this. All we know is that Moses, who we know for sure was a prophet, told us, treat these people as prophets. Indeed, the Rambam makes the following comparison. He says, suppose a person is accused of a crime, and two witnesses come before the court, and they say, we're eyewitnesses, and we saw it happen. Do the judges know that it happened? And Rambam says no. All they know is when you have testimony, and the testimony fits the legal criteria, then you punish him. So they're following the law to punish him. And that law goes back to Moses. So true prophecy starts with the direct knowledge that we have of Moses' prophecy, plus Moses' rules, how to identify and treat people as prophets when they pass those rules. That's the end of the story. Nothing else counts. So since the non-Jewish so-called prophets, the claims of prophecy, have none of that verification, none of that credibility, we just simply don't take them into account.
What again, the credibility in this regard, because we just said we treat them as prophets,
Again, we're not going to give Muhammad credibility because, first of all, no nation heard God speaking to him, and number two, our rules don't apply to him. Okay. Our rules don't. One of the rules to being a prophet is that you have to be a person who fulfills all of the Jewish rules, and he didn't. In fact, according to many sources, you'd have to be Jewish. There was a period in history when non-Jews were prophets, but that ended when the Torah was given. So he's just categorically out. Okay, so now when you talk about the experience, so now we have a tradition, and if you learn the tradition from the inside, and you appreciate what it says and what it's about, and you get to know the people who, from the outside, who lived it and practiced it, you end up experientially overwhelmed in such a way that taking seriously that it isn't true is not an option, and that could be called knowledge. There are many such stories, but I just heard a story this afternoon from my Rebbitzin, and there are many such stories. There was a man, an Israeli, who had cancer, and who the only treatment for him was in the United States. So he went to the United States, and they performed the treatment, and it failed. And he wanted to come home to Israel to die and be buried. So they booked a ticket on a plane, and with someone accompanying him. And the two men were under the care of an institution of the Satmar Hasidim who help sick people. They exist all over the world, and they supply enormous resources, even here in Israel also. And they came to the airport. The person who representing that institution happened to be a woman. They come to the desk where the tickets are presented, and the patient looked so frail that the airline representative behind the desk said, "I can't let you go on the flight because you're too frail. I can't take responsibility for you." So the woman representing the Satmar institution, without a word, took off her pearls, put them on the desk, and passed them to the airline representative. He got on the flight. That's just, nobody knows who she is. This wasn't written up anywhere. This is mouth to mouth, people talking about it. But nobody knows who she is. You live around people who do things like that spontaneously. Kloisenberger Rebbe lived through the Holocaust. He lost 11 family members. He vowed when it was over that he would build a public institution in the memory of each of them, and he did it. He ended up in America with a small group, and he built it into a Hasidus of thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people. The Baba Rebbe came through the Holocaust, lost his wife, children, one son, I think, he survived. He started with the yeshiva in New York City with 16 students. When he died, 100,000 people came to the funeral. So you're talking about people who did things that are just beyond the norm, what you can describe for a human being. Both that they survived, and that they survived with their trust and belief in the Kadosh Baruch Hu intact. And they took on the responsibility for whole communities of people, and they weren't the only ones. The Satmar Rebbe also did a similar thing. The Mir Yeshiva was in China, in Shanghai, during the war, and made it to the States. By the way, they were in Japan before they got to China. And when they were in Japan, they're Jews after all. One of the Japanese officials said to them, "You know, the Germans hate you. The Germans think that you're evil, and the Germans aren't stupid. What should we do about that?" And the rabbi said, "After they conquer Europe, you're next, because you're yellow, you're not white." Oh, okay, I gotcha. I hear you. Right. So I guess we shouldn't take the Germans, as at face value, and because they're smart, you must be bad, and so forth and so on, because we're next. I got you. Okay, I hear you. But the things that these people went through, and the things that they did, someone said that if Darwin had met a Jew like this, he could never have written his book, The Descent of Man, that human beings are are modified animals, because this kind of behavior is so far from the animal world. There's just no connection. There's no way to move from a lemur, step by little step, to Rabbi Salanter. There's just no path that would give you that connection. So I think that you can fill the gap experientially, and you can come to something called knowledge that way. Now that isn't what the philosophers do. The philosophers are trying to find something abstract, some kind of abstract rule, how much probability, or what kind of probability, what kind of evidence, and so forth and so on. Okay, it's a philosophical project, Some have succeeded, some have failed, and some are still in doubt as to whether they could fail or not, could succeed or not. And as long as they get paid for doing it, they'll do it. But at any rate, that's the standard of knowledge that you have to have. Now, when you are making a decision, and again, I'm speaking to people on the outside, making a decision about how to live your life, so that's a big decision. It covers a gigantic amount of your concerns and your hopes and dreams and priorities. And it would require, for the vast majority of people who weren't raised in a religious home, a serious adjustment. But so do other things. It's famous. It was even famous when I was a kid about 230 years ago. And it's even more famous today that parents send their children to college, and the children are turned upside down. In particular, they become enemies of their parents because their rotten professors teach them politics instead of content, and use their semantic tricks and their authority to push them into a corner, and then their whole lives are turned upside down. Their values, their priorities, their hopes for the future are vastly transformed. And some of them manage it, unfortunately. Some of them manage it tragically to transform themselves into this new creature that the professors want them to be. So it can be done. And they, of course, think that they're at an advantage. They think they're improving their lives when they're really destroying their lives. But the transformation is made. So it is possible to make transformations like this. And deep down, from our point of view, what aids the transformation is that you discover in yourself dimensions that you didn't know were there. It's not just a question of following the statistics. And I'll give you an example, which probably most, if not all of you who are sitting here or watching the video have experienced, and that's exercise. People who exercise regularly, I would say, all of them, or the vast majority, say their lives are better. Now, if you're a skeptic from Brooklyn, you said, yeah, they have to cover up, or they have to, pretend that they didn't make a stupid choice by going to the gym and so on and so on. That may be true for 2%, but for the vast majority, and I'm one of them, when you exercise regularly, you feel better, you sleep better, you eat better, you have more energy, you're more positive. Exercise really does improve the quality of life. So if you start off by saying, here are the statistics, people who exercise have less heart disease and less cholesterol and so on and so on, and you have all the statistics, fine, that's in your head. But if what's in your head leads you to actually start an exercise routine, and then you start to feel better, then you become much more positive about exercise. So it's not just a question of following the external objective evidence. It's that the practice awakens within you certain responses which you didn't anticipate in yourself, you didn't know were there, and they are, in a certain sense, self-verifying. When you start to take on Jewish practice and you feel a naturalness about certain of the values, you feel a certain fulfillment that you wouldn't have predicted is there, then you realize the system really does relate to you as an individual in a way that you didn't anticipate. I remember when I was becoming religious, when I was in college, and I learned there's some controversy about whether you can study for exams on Shabbos. It's not open and shut. And I came to the first exam period, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I hadn't made a decision. I didn't ask a rabbi what I should do or not. I knew there was a problem. Okay, then it came Friday night. We made kiddush, and we had a meal, and there was divrei Torah, and there was singing, and there was dancing. Very nice. Shabbos morning, I got up, went to shul, and then we had another meal, same thing, and a rest in the afternoon, and then it was winter time, it was January, and then short afternoon, went to shul for mincha, came back, ate the third meal, went to shul, and Dovid, and I thought, hey, the whole Shabbos went by. I didn't even think of it. I didn't make any decisions, it just wasn't in my mind. I thought, wow, look at that. I mean, usually I'm concerned about exams. Usually I want to do well, and I have a healthy fear of the challenge. It was gone. I was shocked at myself. I wasn't really fully committed at that time. I was just trying it out. And yet, the spirit of it took me over. So when you have experiences like that, this fills in a kind of experiential contribution to the probability that you have and moves you more in the direction of knowledge rather than just making a good bet and calculating how much the bet is worth and seeing that your expected return is bigger than the amount that you're investing in the process. And that way you can achieve knowledge that the Torah is true, knowledge which goes beyond the mere probability that I described in my book. Okay.